Okay.
Getting to know Artie through this board thing, he would have some really good ideas, although they were mostly something that was a bit self-centered. But we came to dread the moment Artie would start to speak, because after about a minute and a half, he would get up and start walking around and talking. And he was good, I'm not exaggerating, he was good for at least half an hour. And it was almost impossible to interrupt him. And of course we all had respect for him. Really terrible. He was a champion talker. And you know, a lot of what he said made sense, but it was far too long. Before that, before I had the pleasure of meeting him, getting to know him, there was a place called Bop City, which opened with a great deal of fanfare. It was in the Times Square area in the 40s, in the 50s. It was almost opposite Birdland, and it was upstairs, and it was a big place. I think it had been a restaurant, and it opened with enormous fanfare and everything, and of course it turned out to be a flop. It didn't last very long at all. But I forget whether it was the opening attraction. It might well have been. They had double or even sometimes triple bills, but this was Artie Shaw with a kind of reduced philharmonic. It was a classical program. Artie and Benny Goodman, of course, had professional competitiveness, but on Benny's part, I wouldn't consider it jealousy. On Artie's part, however, it was. Of course, Benny had gotten there before him, and Benny was generally regarded as, well, the king of swing. So there was a sense of rivalry there. To make an aside, many years later, Leonard Feather, who liked to do things like that, did a thing in the LA Times, did a poll about, you know, who was the greatest on all the instruments, you know, and Benny wound up to get the clarinet first. Artie called Leonard and chewed him out about that. Said, how could you? So even that late in the game, when Artie was nearing 90 somewhere, it still was there. So Benny had established a reputation as a classical clarinetist. He had recorded and commissioned Bartok. He commissioned Aaron Copland for a clarinet concerto. He had done Mozart with the Budapest. Artie had not done anything like that, but he was certainly acquainted with classical music. He was a very well-educated person, and mostly self, but very good. Certainly more intellectually ambitious than Benny, but, you know. So the Bop City thing, he presented himself with a reduced, it was bigger than a string quartet, but smaller than a philharmonic, but it was a fairly sizable complement. And with a classical repertoire, mostly things that were adapted. And I forget exactly what was on the program. I was there, I went. It was, Artie also conducted. It was ambitious. I didn't think it was particularly wonderful, but it was professional. And certainly Artie, the great clarinetist, he had a beautiful sound and he was executing very well. And being somewhat familiar with classical music, I did not think that this was in any way a, what shall we say, a disgrace. So Downbeat at that time had a guy, he was actually really not that active anymore as a writer on staff. His name was Levin.
Mike Levin.
Yeah. And Mike Levin was a controversist, he liked to do stuff like that. He reviewed this and gave Artie a savage, nasty review, really out of, if I had been editor at the time, I would not have printed it, or I would have told them to tone it down. Because it was really malicious, it really was. And having been there, unnecessarily so. You could have said legitimately, this kind of thing usually doesn't work out that well. As far as the adaptations of the material were concerned, they were okay, but not much more than that. They were not exactly brilliant. As for Artie's playing, no question that he can play the clarinet, but his interpretation of this music, and there was nothing, they were mostly shorter pieces. There was no clarinet concerto or anything like that. Artie recorded the Mozart Clarinet Quintet, which Goodman had done years before with the Budapest. He recorded it, that was later than the Bop City, with an excellent quartet, nicely done. So this review was really, it was really a malicious piece of work. And Artie never did anything like that again. And I think it really, everybody, he didn't exactly have a patented ego. So I forget what his response to it was. Around this time also, Artie was involved with the Un-American Activities Committee. Remember that?
Yes.
That was a terrible thing, which now in the days of all the stuff that's going on in the Trump era, but this was, about the lower depths. It preceded McCarthy a bit, but it was just as bad as him. And this was an inquiry into whether you had ever been and ever whatever, a communist or, and it was mostly an attack on Hollywood people. And most of the upper regions of Hollywood were openly against it, where Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, who were a couple, were prominent in that. But there were people who testified. Adolphe Manjou was a main one, really turned out to be a red baiter. And Gary Cooper turned out to be not very intelligent. And, it was interesting to watch, but it was very embarrassing and very, uncalled for and undemocratic. And Artie was one of the people who was called upon. And the main thing was, for us who were somewhat to the left at least, that people were asked to name, did you know anybody who, who was a communist? And the thing was that the people we respected refused to do that. They would not name anybody. They wouldn't take the fifth, But Artie did sing, he did mention some names, and I think that was probably the low point of his long career, was that he did that. And I was surprised that he did, because at that time he no longer had that big, I mean, he made plenty of money and he didn't have that big a career anymore for him to justify that. But that's aside from you getting into other things. Much nicer later on, Artie, you know, when he started the band again and didn't play but only led it, and among other people, Daryl Sherman was one of his, was the vocalist, and it was interesting to see him get back into that. And of course, he had also established himself as a writer. Trouble with Cinderella. He was a good writer. He should have written more. And actually, there exists somewhere, probably in the hands of his estranged kids, manuscripts, which might be, he was going to write a major novel in which he was the main character. So anyway, after this acquaintance with Artie in the board, New York Museum board, and also because later on he became acquainted with Loren Schoemberg, so I became kind of, he lived in LA by then, distantly friendly with Artie. When he turned 90, I sent him a birthday card to wish it, and much to my surprise, he called me to thank me for. I figured he'd get hundreds of cards, but apparently not. So he called me and we had a conversation, and that's where he said, "By the way, how old are you?" And I said 72, and he said, "Ah, you're playing with hoops." Which I quoted sometimes. He then also asked me to write liner notes for him, because they were issuing stuff that he had with the quintet that was one of his last things, and very good stuff. And Loren, who had also come to know him, did some of the notes, and I did, and we were both on the phone with him talking about these notes, and that was when we got another sampling of his his tendency to talk at long periods. But it was different from the experience with the board, because he was really an interesting talker. And when he talked about all kinds of things, he loved Lester Young. He said Lester was an influence on him, and he was also a big Louis man, which is everybody of his generation have to be. But he had very interesting things to say, and you know, it was nice to become acquainted with him on the telephone. But there was a lot of sidetracking. When he got into something, he would digress, and Loren and I knew, we usually would be the three of us on the phone. We knew that it would be good for, you know, an afternoon or whatever. And Benny Carter lived near Artie in California, and they were not close or anything, but they would see each other occasionally and so on. Benny said, this was not long after Artie died, that he was taking a walk one day, and you know, you don't walk much in LA, but he was walking a bit in a little park that was there or something, and he saw somebody sitting on a bench all by himself, and I thought he looked familiar, and he turned around and went, and it was Artie. And he said he was there sitting all by himself on a park bench, you know, and he thought it was kind of sad. So, you know, but getting back to the music, unfortunately, hearing Artie in that Bop City setting is the only time that I caught him live. Because this was in between, he had already given up the band, and he hadn't started, it wasn't until years later that he started up again. So he was a complex person, and but I still, I mean, I'm still an Artie Shaw fan. I love those things with Helen Forrest, who is one of my favorite singers at that time, and he had some interesting Eddie Sauter arrangements. There's several stages of the band. The band he had fairly late on with Roy. Roy is very well featured. Little Jazz. The last small groups, the last Gramercy Five. He just always very tasteful, and his repertoire to me was more interesting, big band repertoire, than Benny Goodman's. He would do things like Sigarner, which is a beautiful Noel Coward tune. Vilja he did, you know, I mean, I think that he was interested in things that were off the beaten jazz path. And he had a beautiful sense of form. I mean, everybody knows his Stardust solo, you know. But there's an air check of Stardust from a somewhat different period. Solo is almost just as good. So he was an inventive guy. And you have people like Panassier, you know, who had his nearsightedness, who wouldn't even give him consideration as a legitimate jazz figure, you know, which is bullshit. But I loved Artie's sound. And don't make it, I'm a big Benny Goodman fan. I had more Benny Goodman records than Artie Shaw records. And the sextet with Charlie Christian and Cootie Williams. When we were talking about interviews in that oral history project, and you know, interesting things. There's one with Cootie Williams, who of course was heavily featured with Benny, not only the sextet, but in the big band. And there was Superman, which was a feature for him by Eddie Sauter, and he is well represented. Sometimes you find a surprising Cootie solo on a thing with a Helen Forrest vocal and so on, and he's really there. In the interview that was done in that oral history project, Helen Dance was the interviewer. And Helen, of course, we know as Stanley Dance's wife, and I think I talked about her in her own right as somebody who was actually hipper than Stanley, you know. But in this case, she wasn't very hip at all, because she was asking Cootie about his Benny Goodman period, you know, and she started off being an Ellingtonian with the fact that when you left Duke, he told you that it was okay to be in the small group, but don't play in the big band, you know. And Cootie chuckled at that, but he left it there, didn't say anything, because obviously he did. But Helen did not, apparently, you know, to my surprise, she didn't know that. She didn't know that. But they talked about Benny for a while, about it being, and Cootie wound up saying, which certainly I would have liked to see the expression on Helen's face at that point. He said, the time I spent with Benny Goodman were the happiest musical time of my musical life. What? Well, you know, obviously he had left Duke by then, and it took quite a while for him to get back to Duke. And I think, honestly, when he went back with Duke, it was something that he pretty much had to do, because his own band had long since failed and he wasn't really doing that well. But you know, there was a tenuous relationship there, obviously. But that he should say that, and he said that to Helen Dance, she didn't pick up on it. She didn't pick up on it. But, you know, it is feasible. He was very well featured. There was Charlie Christian. The sextet was a wonderful framework for him. He wasn't under any kind of, you know, stress to do certain things, and he didn't have to play the same things all the time, which he pretty much had to do with them. So you have the period with the small groups, which is wonderful, and that's where you hear some of his best stuff. Anyway, that wonderful thing in that interview, which is otherwise very good, is he talks about how much he loved Louis, and it's just a fairly early period when Ellington was at the Cotton Club and Louis was playing at that time for a while at the Lincoln Theater, which wasn't too far away. And Cootie said he pleaded with Duke to time the things in such a way that he could, in between sets, he could run over to the Lincoln and hear Louis. And then also, he said they quit at such a time that he was able to go to backstage to the theater and meet Louis. And he said he would carry his trumpet case to Louis' hotel. Those are the, you know, those things are beautiful, you know. Little things like that don't get into the history books, but they have a human quality that I think that, is that you or me?